Vampires. From wayward souls who became cursed to take the lives of others, to eventually become romanticized in literature and media. These mythological creatures have been reshaped through the centuries. The vampire is an excellent example of how popular opinion and interest can reshape a story in a complete opposite direction. However, now we're finding ourselves in a bit of a conundrum. How do we distinguish myth from reality? Is there any truth to the myth? Do vampires truly walk among us, or are people just losing their grip on reality and what is real? From ancient Mesopotamia to the Victorian day and the modern era, I will be walking you through some key points in history that shaped where we are now. This will all lead to the final question: are vampires real? Are they walking among us? The origin of the word vampire is very long and complex of a story. Multiple countries, multiple dates, and multiple versions created this word. But one thing remained the same: the characteristics of a vampire. Being undead, drinking blood, things of that nature. Because although the term vampire only started a few centuries ago, the concept of a vampire dates back to ancient civilizations. And ancient stories and folklore attribute a vampire to be one of these three things. Number one, a demon, which is also an evil spirit. And before the Bible, it would just sort of be called an evil spirit. But once the New Testament came and brought about the idea of hell and Satan and Lucifer, it became more of a figure from down there. Number two, a deity. These are our gods and goddesses, or minor gods and goddesses, or proto-gods and goddesses that are from pagan myth. And number three, most important, is a revenant. If you're not familiar with what a revenant is, it does come up quite a lot in the history of vampires, so we'll just discuss it really quick. It is a spirit or animated corpse. So essentially it is a human being who died, and they've been revived from death, and they're there to hunt the living, or they're there for whatever nefarious thing they are. But a revenant pretty much means an undead. All right, with those three terms explained, let's hop into the ancient history. In this video, I've pulled out key moments in history, so I haven't listed every single instance of vampire or vampire-like being in history, because there's a lot of them. I started at first, but the list was getting really out of hand. So instead, what I decided to do was just pull out key moments and key stories that are important to understand how we got to where we are now, and to understand how it shaped what a vampire is in our eyes in modern day. To start, we're going to go over ancient Greece. Ancient Greece may have the oldest significant story about vampires. The civilization existed from 1050 BCE to 600 AD. These stories don't have a specific date on when they are created, but they've been around for a long time and they were part of the ancient Greek mythos. So I'm going to go over a few of these creatures and give you the background on their stories, because they will shape the future stories that come up. The Abusa. Abusa was the daughter of the goddess Hecate. Her precise creation is unknown, but she has been categorized as a phantom or a specter. She does not hold the rank of any deity or proto-deity, so it could be very likely that Hecate created her versus actually giving birth to her. Hecate is the goddess of witchcraft, so she is capable of shaping things around her like that. And Buza could shapeshift into anything she wanted. Often she would present herself as an attractive woman so she could seduce young men and feast on their blood while they slept. She is the first example of a succubus. Now here we begin with our first sort of conundrum: succubus versus vampires. It does come up a lot in the history of vampires, so it also begs the question, are they the same being or are they different? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Lamia. Lamia was a queen of ancient Libya who had an affair with Zeus. Hera, Zeus's wife, got very angry when she found out about it, and she killed or kidnapped all of Lamia's children. It is said that Hera also cursed her with insomnia and the inability to close her eyes. This caused Lamia to go insane and turned her into a vengeful being that snatched up other people's children and she ate them. Additionally, her outside self began looking like how she felt inside, like an ugly monster who is angry and acting without forethought. Zeus ended up granting Lamia the power of prophecy and the ability to take her eyes in and out of her head, possibly to help curb the part of the curse that his wife caused to her. He also gave Lamia the ability to shapeshift. Some historians have also linked her form to be serpentine in nature, a half woman and a half snake. In the 1st century AD, her mythos began to change, and they said she would also seduce men and drain their life in bed. So it wasn't just children anymore, now it included men. And thus we face another link to a succubus. But before Lamia was changed, there was one more creature in ancient Greece that should be mentioned as well. And that is the Striges, or some might call them the Strix. The Striges or Strix are exactly the same as Lamia, except they feed on adults as well. They were described as having the bodies of birds and were later incorporated into Roman mythology as a Strix, a kind of nocturnal bird that fed on human flesh. The term Strix does end up in future mythos in other countries as well, so that's why I wanted to include it here. Alright, those are the 3 most important stories from ancient Greece. Now let's hop into ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt. Between 715 and 664 BCE is when our story took place. And this is the story of Sekhmet. Many people link the story of Sekhmet to a vampire reference in ancient Egypt, so it deserves an honorable mention in the history of vampires. The god Ra got upset after finding out that mortals were conspiring against him. So he sent down Hathor, who is the female equivalent to Ra, and Hathor was sent in the form of Sekhmet, a female body with the head of a lion. Sekhmet lost herself in the bloodlust and she could not stop killing. The mortals were facing actual extermination by her hands, and the human race was about to be over. And Ra couldn't get her to stop. She was too caught up in her bloodlust. So Ra and the other gods had to hatch a plan to get her to stop. They decided that they would fill the Nile with beer, and they dyed it red with ochre so it would look like blood. Eventually she stumbled upon the Nile and she took a drink from it. Seeing that it was blood, she kept drinking and drinking until she became so intoxicated that she just completely lost interest in what she was doing and she went back home. Now, with that story, it has actual parallel to a story in ancient India. Ancient India, 700 BCE. This is the story of Kali. Kali is a Hindu goddess that shares some characteristics with the story of Sekhmet. The main characteristic is the drinking blood and the rage. A myth describes how Kali became ecstatic with the joy of battle and slaughter while she was killing demons, and she refused to stop until she was pacified by her consort Shiva. He had to throw himself at her feet to get her to stop. So it's somewhat of a similar story, and they were released somewhat in the same time as well, so that's kind of interesting. Possibly one affected the other, who knows? All right, next we're going to talk about the most important ancient civilization and ancient historic story that actually affected vampire lore going forward. 900 to 331 BCE in Mesopotamia, but also Babylonia, Persia, Sumer. A bunch of these countries are all connected, but most people say Mesopotamia, where the main story came from. And the creatures we're going to be discussing are Lamashtu, Lilu, Lilitu, and Lilith. So this is one of the more complex stories. But this story eventually leads to the link with demons and the Bible, and eventually into some mythos about hell. To understand the mythology at this time, let me first explain a few things. During this time in human history, everyone was beginning to adopt like the one God, and in this particular area, this was a lot of Jewish religions, so they were already kind of worshiping the one God, but they had to explain why bad things happen. And they were like, if God wanted more children, or, if our purpose is to bring more children into this world, why do we keep dying during childbirth? So a story had to kind of be created as to like why people are dying, good people are dying when they don't deserve to die, or why children, aren't surviving, maybe they get sick or whatever it may be. So that is when they developed this mythos to kind of explain that, okay, it's not that God is saying, I'm going to take these souls. It's that there's a demon that's coming in and affecting women and children. And so that is where this whole myth was kind of based on. And they also recently found like pots with this myth actually drawn in little like images. It sort of like tells a story. And they found these stories of these before the Jewish religion was really like stabilized in the area. So they think that it may have been like an adoption as well of some pagan rites too. But essentially, these are just demons that they can explain off as to why bad things happen to people. All right, so let's get into explaining exactly what they are. So at the beginning of this story, we have the goddess Lamashtu. Eventually, people were referring to as a female demon, but she was also known as a malevolent goddess or demigoddess. Her father was the sky god Anu, and Lamashtu was said to act in malevolence of her own accord. Rather than taking orders from the gods or following what other gods do, she just did what she wanted when she wanted. And that is why she did harm upon people. So the story initially starts off with this first goddess, and this was an explanation as to why bad things happen to people, was this goddess who wasn't following rules and doing whatever she wanted. So people at the time believed that she would cause harm to women during childbirth, steal children who are still breastfeeding. And then part of her story, and this is where it links into vampires, is they said that she would suck on the blood of her victims and then chew their bones. Now, eventually, over time, Lamashtu morphed into Lilu and Lili-Tu. Now, these are both the same being. It's just Lili-Tu attacks men and Lilu attacks women. And scholars are now thinking that this is just a classification that they had, not necessarily the name of the demon, but this is how they classified this particular type of demon back then. And these are just the male and the female versions of the language. All right, so Lili-Tu attacks men, Lilu attacking women. Lilu is also blamed for childbirth issues, death of children, things like that. If anyone got sick, if they ended up with smallpox or something, things like that, they would end up like blaming on these particular demons or spirits. Eventually, as the Jewish religion kind of got further cemented out, Lilu and Lili-Tu was morphed into Lilith. So they were first a pagan belief, and then they got morphed into the Bible. So eventually the story of Lilith was adopted and added into the Jewish religion in the book of Isaiah. This is the way that they kind of combined religions back then. If anyone is writing these books, they can see that this would be a good sort of scapegoat for why bad things happen to good people. All about Lilith. A lot of people say that Lilith is like the mother of demons. A lot of other people also say that she's the mother of vampires, because vampires technically fall under demons. And that's a whole other discussion. That's why Lilith is important for us to discuss her origins and where she came from. Lilith was Adam's first wife before Eve. Now I say was because she refused to submit to Adam. They were both created at the same time, and she saw that they should both be equal. Adam disagreed, and so she refused to essentially submit to him. And this caused her to get apparently kicked out of Eden. But some people said that she left on her own, whatever it may be. They kind of developed a story that sort of matched an existing pagan story, right? They kind of fleshed it out with a story that would make sense for the Garden of Eden. So she was cast out, and then she ended up becoming the mother of all demons. Much like the Greek Strix, Lilith would prey on young babies and their mothers at night, as well as males. So that is the background story for how we got to Lilith, and a background story cementing that there were like beings in folklore that would drink blood. And that's sort of like the big important stories that are in ancient civilization. But now let's get into what happened in the current era, in BCE or AD. In the current era, or some people refer to as AD for after death, with Christianity becoming more prevalent than ever, all the vampire folklore developed similar aspects across many cultures and centuries. These vampires go by different names, but they're all very similar in a description of how they attack people, what they look like, things of that nature. In these older mythologies, vampires often would come from a distressed woman who lost her child, or, lost her spouse, or something that pretty much left her unfulfilled before she died. Essentially, she died like a broken-hearted woman. And a lot of these creatures we're going to talk about kind of came from women in these particular situations. In the cases where it's not related to a woman, then the vampire creature is usually based on people who weren't pious enough, or were just in general like bad people, like murderers and things like that. But there's also some stories where some people are considered cursed when they were born because they were born with some kind of deformity. And we're talking like, this is like the early civilizations of humans here in the current era. So there's a lot of silliness in these deformities. Like one of the deformities is if you were born with red hair, or if you have red hair, then you're going to be a vampire, essentially. It's kind of similar to like how they were finding witches and finding ways to say that someone was a witch. So it's a little silly, that sort of side of it, but it only comes in a couple countries that end up doing that. All right, so from 1 CE until about the 11th century, there are a lot of little stories scattered around, too many to list into this video. Instead, we're going to pop ahead up to the 11th century, because this is when the word vampire was actually born, was created. 11th century. The Slavic regions. So this is in the Slavic regions. We're talking Turkey, Ukraine, Russia, Prussia, things like that. I'm going to be going over a pretty big list of names that were all very similar, but they were to each little area in the region, and I'll put them up on the screen for you as well. But these names eventually shaped the word vampire that we use now. So the first known reference to vampires appeared in written form in Old Russian in 1047 CE. From this region, there were many names for a vampire. These multitude of names eventually shaped the word vampire or vampire that was adopted in our modern mythos. So let's go over each. I'm going to give you the names, and I'm going to tell you what country they reside from. Opior, as well as Ubir, and this was in the Tatar region. Ubir, Obir was in Turkey. Vampyre was Belarusian. Vampyre was Bulgarian. Vampyre was Serbian. Upir was Czech and Slovakian. Ubior again comes up, but it's also paired with Wupi, and that's Polish. Upir, Russian and Ukrainian. And then also Upir, spelled a different way in Old East Slavic. Onpir was Turkic. All of these names refer to one demonic being from the Slavic area, the region. And this being was a prototype of the vampire. This being had a little bit of different aspects to it depending on which region that people in the story was coming from. An interesting one is in Poland, a person cursed before death, the upior, arrived at night carrying their heads in their arms, or if the head was not detached, they would have glowing wolf-like eyes. Upiors drank blood, human blood, and they had superhuman strength, and they would use that to sometimes also attack them, essentially. Kind of seemed like it was a sort of mix with a vampire and a werewolf. They could also kill with their breath or shrieks as well. They were said to harass people at night, making them suffocate or sleepwalk. There were claims of husbands and wives coming back as upiors, and they would visit the widowed spouse. They would do odd things sometimes, like they would do the chores, but that would creep out the spouse, and then at night they would get more violent, harass the spouse and harass the remaining family. Now, there's a story for each one of those in the list, but we don't want this video to be like 5 hours, so I'm not going to go through every story. I just found that to be the most interesting story. However, mainly, vampires began to be blamed for disease and death. Somewhere between the 10th and 12th century, historians have linked vampire panics to rabies outbreaks because of the biting of people and the biting from animals. They get a bite, and then that person gets sick, and then that person starts to become feral. Eventually, vampires were linked to other diseases and outbreaks, which we'll get more into as well, as they also link to research on the physiology and scientific research that was being done on vampires or vampire attacks, and that sort of created a bit of the rules of how you kill a vampire, how you identify if a body is a vampire. Now, things just kind of moved this way for some time, but heading into the 15th century, we have two classic stories that everyone always brings up about vampires. I think we should touch on them because they're the classic ones that, everyone talks about, and it's kind of weird to just leave them out. So I'm going to go over them really quick. 1448 to 1477, we see Vlad the Impaler. So Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad Dracula, ruled over Wallachia in the 15th century. He developed a reputation of being extremely brutal, and the way he executed his enemies garnered him the nickname the Impaler. So you can use your imagination. Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, drew inspiration from Vlad when creating his iconic vampire character, Count Dracula. Vlad's castle is still standing in Romania today and is a popular travel destination. 1565. Now we find ourselves in Hungary. Elizabeth Bathory, otherwise known as the Blood Countess. Elizabeth was a noblewoman, a countess who owned land in Hungary. And it is said that Bathory and her 4 servants were grabbing young female virgins and taking their lives, along with a few other things that they were doing to them. And they did this between 1590 and 1610. It is said Bathory would bathe in their blood because she thought it would make her look more youthful. She was eventually arrested with her servants, and she was imprisoned in the castle of... I looked up the word for this castle. I'm going to put it on the screen. I cannot pronounce it. Pronounce them like Chike or something like that, but I'll put it up on the screen. Elizabeth died under mysterious circumstances while she was being imprisoned. But some recent historians are now claiming that she may have actually been innocent. They claim that it was all done to destroy her family name, as her family influence over that region was a threat to neighboring regions. Apparently, stories of her bathing in blood and the details of what she did to the girls only appeared after her death. So now there's some information coming forward that she may not have done this. However, I have also read some other information that said there were still girls going missing at her castle. So something was still happening to people by the sounds of it, but it may not have been her bathing in blood. It may have been something else going on. So although there's debate about the extent of her crimes, the story has contributed to the popular image of vampires as bloodthirsty aristocrats. But you tell me, what do you think about Bathory? Do you think that she might actually be innocent? What are your thoughts on that? All right, up next, I'm going to talk about some treaties. And back then, treaties were just sort of like written works that people made to kind of pass along information. And there was a few of them that listed things. And this is where we got the, stake through the heart, and they have to be invited into the home, girl that keeps them away. Like, this is where people kind of develop these things. Also, like explanations of what bodies look like that might turn into vampires too. And these are the documentations. And there's just a few that I pulled out that I'll just briefly touch on. So just to help you understand, this is how some of the information got around. Is people wrote these treaties and then they passed them around to people within the scientific community, which was, a bit of a weird community back then, but, eventually grew from there. So let's talk a little bit about some of the treaties. In 1645 in Greece, a Greek librarian of the Vatican, Leo Alatius, produced the first methodological description of the Balkan beliefs in vampires, or the Greek version is Vrykolakas. The document was called On Certain Modern Opinions Among the Greeks. This would be the first of many texts that would begin breaking down what a vampire is and how to defeat them. However, in this treaty, the way he describes vampires, they come across more as zombies. So this is one of the first treaties, and he talks about the Vrykolakas being undead. He says that they're equated with vampire lore. He links them in this document. But the way he describes them is they're more like undead ghoul-like, and they eat organs, but they don't drink blood. So they kind of are described in a way that it sounds like they're zombies. However, this treaty did explain how to prevent vampires from rising. In the treaty, he explains that you need to pierce the body's heart with iron nails while they are asleep in their coffins. In the most severe cases, the recommended action was to burn the body and scatter the ashes. At the time, the church opposed burning people who were baptized, so cremation was considered a last resort, as it was sort of like blasphemy onto the person's soul or whatever it may be. So a lot of this early folk belief in vampires has sometimes been ascribed to the ignorance of the body's process of decomposition after death. And they use this as examples to be able to see a vampire in its coffin. Things like growing nails, the hair is growing if the body looks engorged. But growing nails in the hair, well, that's because the skin is dehydrating, moving away from the body. The engorging, that's just part of the decay process as well. So this is where like a lot of this stuff kind of started developing, and they were digging up bodies and looking at them and deciding that they were vampires because of these treaties and this checklist of things that they need to check off. In 1733, Johann Christoph Herrenberg wrote a general treaty on vampires and the local cases in the city, Marquis d'Argent. In this treaty, he discusses the body descriptions, how to look for a vampire, and how to kill vampires. Then in 1746, Dom Augustin Calmet, a well-respected French theologian and scholar, put together a very comprehensive treaty concerning the existence of vampires. Numerous readers, including both a critic and a demonologist, said this treaty proved that vampires are real. So we have essentially scientists in that timeline signing off on this, saying, yeah, this is for real. As well, there was a very popular writer back then, Voltaire, that a lot of people probably know about if you're into literature. And from this writing, he also added into his philosophical dictionary, these vampires were corpses who went out of their graves at night to suck the blood of the living, either at their throats or stomachs, after which they returned to the cemeteries. The person so sucked waned, grew pale, and fell into consumption, while the sucking corpses grew fat, rosy, and enjoyed an excellent appetite. So you can see now a lot of the vampire lore getting spread across different countries and kind of getting signed off on by people who are well respected, whether like scientific or literature, whatever it may be. These treaties were used to hunt vampires, and then this is when the hysteria started erupting. And because this is a time where a lot of diseases started popping up, we have the consumption, which started, which is tuberculosis, and there was other diseases like scarlet fever and other things like that. So a lot of them were being blamed on vampires, and people needed some sort of out. And again, disease and people dying, good people dying, this goes back to the original in Babylonia, how they use this original Lilu for explaining why these things are happening. So now we hit the Age of Enlightenment. but also the age of spiritualism, the 18th century. And this is when vampire hysteria started getting a little out of control. So I'm going to tell you the story of two very influential and popular mass hysteria events to do with vampires, one taking place over in Europe and one taking place in the Americas. All right, let's get into it. Our first story takes place in 1700s in Prussia. And the official name for this in records is the 18th Century Vampire Controversy. That is the official title of the report of this. It all began in 1718. Austria gained control of northern Serbia and Olentia and Oltenia. As the new rulers, they soon witnessed an odd custom. They watched as locals were exhuming bodies to kill vampires. This is when English speakers got introduced to the word vampire, first appearing in news reports in 1732 about a vampire panic in Eastern Europe. This received widespread publicity at the time and traveled all over the world, even across the oceans into the Americas. So, story time. Let's get into the story of what exactly happened and why it led to the official vampire controversy. The vampire controversy began in 1721 in East Prussia with possible vampire attacks and then hit Habsburg monarchy, spreading out from there to many other regions. These two cases, many believe, are the catalyst that started the whole vampire controversy. Essentially, people are saying these were patient zero, and then from there, people kind of lost it and started digging up a lot of bodies. Case 1. Petar Blagojevich died at age 62, but his son soon reported him showing up at his door after his death. He kept asking his son for some food. His son, scared and confused at what was going on, refused to give his father anything. The next day, his son was found dead. Soon after, other neighbors in the area were found dead from blood loss. The region blamed it on Petar and said that he was attacking everyone. Case number 2, Arnold Paoli. A farmer who used to be a soldier died while harvesting hay. It was said he told people that he was attacked by a vampire many years ago when he was fighting wars and whatnot. And this was way before he became a farmer. After Arnold's death, other people in the area began dying as well. So everyone assumed that Arnold rose from the grave and was killing everybody. The most interesting thing about these cases is the documentation. Both cases were well documented. And the reports that were in the cases are written by multiple government officials. They're very detailed, and there's very detailed autopsy reports by those who examined the bodies. The ones who examined the bodies also wrote full books, and these books traveled all over Europe, and these also made it to the Americas as well. The sharing of these stories led to the Hysteria, the 18th century vampire controversy. So during the controversy, people began suspecting neighbors of being vampires. Tons of bodies were getting dug up and desecrated. And this carried on for an entire generation, and it only stopped because the empress at the time, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, she got so frustrated with people living in hysteria. She ended up sending her personal physician, Gerard van Swieten, to investigate the claims of the vampires and to look at all the bodies. He ended up concluding that vampires do not exist, and then the empress ended up passing a law prohibiting the opening of graves and desecration of bodies. This is what eventually ended the hysteria of digging up the bodies. Despite the new law coming and the condemnation of it all, vampires lived on in Prussia in artworks and local superstition for a long time after. The thing that I find interesting about this, at the 18th century was called the Age of Enlightenment. This is the era of enlightenment. This was also the time where a lot of old folklore and beliefs were being dropped. People were realizing they're just stories, but all this new paranormal, creepy stuff was really taking off. This was a time when people's minds were in like a really dark place, and maybe it had to do something with life and death, and maybe between like all the disease and everything that people were dealing with, maybe that's how we kind of got to where we are with this century. But anyway, this whole thing leads us to the next mass hysteria, and it is the vampire panic. 1892, New England. This is the story of the vampire panic. As the belief in vampires began to spread further around the world, New England found themselves soon caught up in the mass hysteria, particularly Rhode Island and eastern Connecticut. Tuberculosis, or otherwise known as the consumption, began running rampant through the area. The people believed that consumption was caused by dead family members who were visiting them at night and making them sick. The most famous case of suspected vampirism is the case of 19-year-old Mercy Lena Brown, who died in Exeter, Rhode Island in 1892. Her brother was now sick, but her father, George Brown, didn't believe in this vampire stuff. He didn't believe in any of this paranormal stuff. The townsfolk wanted him to dig up his daughter and essentially desecrate her body, but he kept saying no, and he kept resisting. But eventually he was pressured a bunch by the community and the church and physicians to dig up his loved ones and desecrate them. Mercy Lena Brown, who was buried next to her mother, both her and her mother were dug up, and a physician looked at the remains and they said that the remains show vampirism. So they ended up cutting out the heart and burning it to ashes. Soon after that, families began digging up a lot of bodies of family members and neighbors, removing their hearts and burning them to ashes, then reburying the bodies. The book Food for the Dead, written by Michael E. Bell, he records that there were 60 bodies in a very short amount of time that were dug up and desecrated. And that's the story of the vampire panic. And now we're going to talk about the 20th century and media, eventually leading into the 21st century and where we are now. By the 20th century, the human anatomy was beginning to be studied in a more rigorous fashion. Robert Nock, at the time, was also trying to convince people that bacteria existed. There were surgeries taking place and people weren't washing their hands, they weren't cleaning out the wounds or nothing, and a lot of people were dying from infections after. So he was trying to explain to people that bacteria existed, and he was labeled crazy, and I think they actually threw him in an insane asylum for a little bit or something too. So this is at the time where people started realizing that what he was saying was true, and then they started looking at things more about the decomposition of bodies, more about human anatomy and things like that. So there were a lot of vampire stuff that had to do with digging up the bodies. A lot of that started to be debunked as just, the way decay happened. So by the end of the 20th century, a lot of this stuff was just gone. And no one dug up bodies looking for signs of vampires. At least, there were some countries still doing it for a while over in Europe, but for the most part, most people understood now, oh, okay, this is just normal decomposition. Science helped quell the majority of this hysteria. So stories of real-life vampires or demons soon also started being replaced by fictional stories of writers. And these were romantic writers who were writing things in a certain way that led us to develop what we see vampires as nowadays. The most influential book that really romanticized vampires and made everyone look at them in a different light was Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, before we get into talking about Bram Stoker's book, there was actually a book released before his that also romanticized vampires and had the aristocratic kind of spin on it too. And that book was called The Vampyre. Written in 1819, this was the first major work of vampire fiction, and it was written by John Polidori. The novella Vampyre introduced the idea of the aristocratic vampire who seduces his victims. This created a more attractive version of a vampire, one that was brooding, good-looking, and just mysterious, or the dark and mysterious man kind of trope. So this would end up being the style for the majority of vampire stories after. This book really did shape all the other ones. Some people believe that Bram Stoker's Dracula was influenced by this book, that this is where he came up with the idea from, but there are stories that he denies this. So who knows what's true and what's not true. There's a lot of different stories flying around about his book. All right, let's talk about Bram Stoker's Dracula. 1897, Bram Stoker published Dracula. With only 3 years before the 20th century, Bram Stoker began the future of vampire in literature. Bram Stoker gave us the most famous of vampires in history, Dracula. Stoker created a more attractive version of vampires, one that had a tortured heart, longing for love, and really romanticized the brooding, dark and mysterious, powerful being. By the 20th century, vampires had become a fixture of popular culture, appearing in films, television shows, and comic books. The 1931 film adaptation of Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, helped solidify the image of the suave, charismatic vampire in the public imagination. Our view of vampires was forever changed from these evil, ugly monsters to cursed humans who had a tortured and lonely heart. All right, so that covers our history of vampires. And now we're going to get into the interesting part. Do they still walk among us? There's some interesting things that have been coming up lately, and let's get into it. I want to show you guys. Do vampires walk among us? There have been some really interesting stories and videos and things like that shared on social media as of late. Stories that are really enthralling, and some of them seem like they might actually be true. But to understand these stories, at least the ones that seem more believable than some of the other ones, we need to talk a little bit about some background of another writer, Anne Rice, and how she transformed or more put a light on New Orleans. Anne Rice's Vampyre series is, in my opinion, the best vampire fictional book series. There are 13 books in the series, but she has a ton of other books and other series she's created. They're all in the same world for the most part, the majority of her books are. So a lot of her other series also makes nods back to the Vampyre series as well. I highly recommend, if you haven't read her books, to go out and read her books. They're some of the best written works about vampires. So I personally grew up with Anne Rice as my favorite author. I was pretty heavily into the vampire scene at one point too, but we'll talk about that after. The world Anne Rice created is heavily centered within New Orleans. She made many of us readers fall in love with the city, and she's a big inspiration for other writers who focus their supernatural stories in New Orleans. New Orleans is a very spiritual city to begin with. From its rich history, mixing of religions and races, it's a fascinating place that isn't scared to show its spiritual side to the world. Anne Rice began holding annual vampire balls there as well. They were huge events, very popular. It also helped further build up the vampire lifestyle as well, outside of just the LARPing and Masquerade. All that being said, back in the day, I remember there was lots of rumors that Anne Rice was writing from experience. Essentially, there was an urban legend that Interviewed the Vampire was mimicking where she got her story from, that she was real life interviewing a vampire and recording their stories and writing them into books. Of course, that was very likely just part of the romanticizing that occurs in the vampire community. But it was an interesting rumor, nonetheless. That being said, however, her books make a really good case for why New Orleans would be one of the most hospitable and welcoming cities to a modern-day vampire. And this brings us back to these stories we're seeing on social media. A lot of the people are opening up their stories with, "This happened in New Orleans," and the storyteller says something like, "If you know, you know." Because people who live in New Orleans do say, like, the environment there feels otherworldly, charged with energy, like there's mysterious, and there's a ton of paranormal businesses and stories and lore there. So if you know about New Orleans and Anne Rice, you can see why a vampire would choose to live there. It sort of brings a portion of credibility to the story, not that we can prove that any of these stories are true. So now that I explained a little bit of the setting here, there's two stories I pulled out I want to show you. Also, just to explain, there's tons of stories going around. Just these are two recent ones, which I found to be very interesting, and I found them to be a little bit more realistic and possibly believable. So we're going to start with a TikTok user. Her name is Fat Girl Freestyle, and she lives in New Orleans, and a lot of her account too, she talks about just the spooky, weird stuff of New Orleans, and she's a driver, and she just has a very interesting story. Let's listen.
Fat Girl Freestyle here with another story time about the time I met a vampire. I'm a rideshare driver in New Orleans. So, of course, I encounter all types of people from all walks of life. So one particular ride was very interesting. Now, this was a couple of years ago when this occurred. And I'm going to tell you, for the most part, I remember what she said. I do not remember what she looked like. And there are some details that when the experience was over, like I had completely forgotten some things. But anyway, I'm riding, pick up this passenger, and I remember our conversation. And the craziest thing is I can remember her voice. I can, and even as I'm telling you this, I can hear her voice in my head. And I can even picture like this part of her face around her mouth, her lips. I can see them moving as she's talking to me. And I remember her hand being on my shoulder. And I remember what it felt like when she touched me. But a lot of other stuff, it's like was just completely erased. So I pick her up, and I do know that we were having conversation. I talked to many of my passengers, and she is telling me I have really great energy. So I told her thank you. She asked me some things about myself, nothing too private, nothing with too many details. So, I just kind of gave her some general info. And I remember her telling me that she wasn't from here. That I do remember. And then she proceeds to tell me how much she loved New Orleans, how much she loved being there, living there, etc., etc. I do recall asking her where she was from originally, and all she told me was that she was from very far away. And it's funny again because I'm hearing her voice in my head as if this is weird. And I've never shared this story with anybody, so TikTok, you're getting it first. She touched my shoulder at one point, and this is where things got really strange. She touched my shoulder, and I felt like I just froze. And even as I'm talking to you right now, I can distinctly remember that feeling of feeling frozen. And my hands were on the wheel because I could see my hands on the wheel. The car wasn't moving. Being frozen in that moment, I hear her voice, but not like I'm here talking to you. In my head, I hear her voice telling me, don't be scared, that she's not going to harm me. And then after that, we're moving again. And I remember kind of turning and looking like that. And she was sitting back in the seat and her hands were on her lap. And I said, what did you do to me? And she just smiled. And she says, I just leached some of your energy. And I said, what? She said, I just leached some of your energy. She said, this is going to sound crazy, but I can assure you it's true. I'm a vampire. She said, but I'm not the type of vampire that you've been taught about in books and movies. She said, those types of vampires exist, but they're very rare these days. I'm a vampire that feeds off of energy, and all I have to do is touch you to get it. She said, New Orleans is a great place for her and her kind to exist, and that there are quite a few members of their tribe, is what she called them. I think I remember this part of our conversation so significantly because I believe when she touched me, she implanted something in my mind, whether you want to call it a memory or a thought or an idea, but she gave me something of herself probably, to where I can recall this portion of the interaction between us. Maybe she knew that eventually I would share the story with others and therefore maybe make it a little bit more acceptable for them to start, for her and her members to start presenting themselves. I don't know. I don't know why she even chose me for this. But she told me that there are vampires that survive off of good energy. There are vampires that survive off of bad energy. There are vampires that survive off of sexual energy. And there are vampires that survive off of blood. And New Orleans is the only place in the world where you can find members of all four of those vampire tribes. Maybe she wanted me to remember this portion of it as a warning. I don't know. I know she wasn't lying just because of how I felt. And even now, it's crazy because I still feel like her hand is on my shoulder, which makes me wonder, when she touched me, did she create some type of psychic connection between the two of us? I don't know, but I think I need to end this. Anyway, I don't remember where I dropped her off at. I don't even remember dropping her off. The next thing I remember doing clearly was being in a part of town that I didn't remember how I even got there. And it was like 2 hours later, and I was just in a parking lot. And I know it sounds weird, y'all. I think I probably shouldn't even recorded this. I probably shouldn't even be talking. I probably should not even be talking about this. I shouldn't.
Now up next, Essence Creations 27. She's a Lyft driver, or she was doing Lyft at the time, and she's just an everyday lady. Like, the rest of her TikTok is pretty like everyday stuff. And her story I found very interesting because it's sort of off topic compared to the rest of her content. So let's take a look.
There's a lady on TikTok talking about her encounter with vampires, so I might as well talk about mine. This New Year's Eve, I was driving Lyft and I picked up an order, and it ended up being at a place that used to be a church, but it wasn't a church anymore, obviously, if you saw the festivities that was going on. There were people with cloaks and dark hair and heavy eyeliner, and there was a red glow from the building coming out. 4 guys got into my car. As soon as they got into the car, I felt a chill. And yes, it was winter, but it was a different kind of chill. I turned around and looked at them, and I immediately knew they were vampires. And it wasn't even just a thought, it was more so a knowing. Before they got into the car, I was thinking maybe they were devil worshippers, because I had seen a goat head and the typical symbols that you see associated with that. But I was no, these are vampires. There were 2 brunettes and 2 blondes. They all had blue eyes, Not that that mean anything, but their eyes were almost hypnotically blue. They were so clear, you could see through not their soul, but I can't even describe it. Their skin was white, but not white like crayon white, but it was very pale, but it was not a pale like, some like white people were like, oh, I'm so pale. Even like red, people with red hair, how pale. It was still a different kind of pale, because even regular people, when they're pale, there's still some warmness to their skin. Like their skin looked cold. I don't know how to describe it. It was more so the feeling of me knowing. Immediately, I start to panic. My heart is racing. I'm feeling like, is it too late to reject a call? Like, can I even ask them to leave the vehicle? And then I started thinking, okay, if I am panicking and my blood pressure is rising, then I'm like pushing more blood through my veins, which may mean that I may seem more appetizing to them. This is all stuff that's going through my mind. The man behind me, the blonde, who was like in the middle, touches my shoulder, and immediately it's like somebody poured warm honey over me. Like that is the calm just spreading down my body. It was like immediately I felt relaxed, almost like I was in a trance kind of there, but like watching myself. I can't even really describe it. And I knew at that moment that I wasn't necessarily in danger. So then the guy is like, well, our car is only a few blocks away, which I could tell from looking at the app. And he's like, but before we get there, we need you to answer a question, and you have to think very carefully about this. So now I'm like, okay, this answer is going to determine if I go home to my children or not. And it could just be my imagination and like me jumping the gun, and he could have been joking, but it didn't feel jokey. So he's like, okay, well, we have 2 separate cars. How would you group us together? Who should ride with who? So I'm like, I look back at them, and they're smiling and they're kind of giggling. Now their teeth don't look like regular teeth, but they don't look like the typical vampire teeth either, but they definitely did not look like human teeth. Their canines were a little bit more pronounced, but not in a dramatic fake way. I can't even freaking describe it. And actually, if I had to describe them, to sketch them out right now, I couldn't even, because it's like they're a memory, but not like a typical memory, like a memory behind a memory. I can't describe it. But anyways, I knew it. I'm like, you're vampires. Yes, I heard the answer in my head. No, I'm looking at them through because I'm like, if they lunge for jugular, I'm gonna crash us all. I grouped the opposite hair colors together, and the guy said, well, why'd you do that? I said, I don't know, it just felt right. He said, excellent choice. He took out his phone and he's like, I'm gonna start my car now. And I'm like, you can start your car from my car? And he's like, yeah, but we like you. You'll get home safe. Good. Like, you'll get home safe tonight. Have a good night. And I was like, yeah, I was kind of thinking that, doing Lyft on New Year's Eve could be dangerous, because like, who knows what kind. I was trying to make it seem like I didn't think they were the danger, but just let them know, like, in case they heard me panicking. Oh, fucking went and saw the vampire. But anyways, they got out and they gave me my biggest tip of the night. You would think that would have been my last ride for the night, but no, I kept going. I made it home, and I didn't tell any other person about this story, because like, are you supposed to share vampire stories? I don't know. However, I just did. So just know that there are other beings in this world besides us, and maybe they're not all so dangerous.
So after listening to that story, what do you think? Do you think that maybe something like that could have happened to her? Do you think that maybe there's another explanation? Like, maybe she's very empathetic, and maybe she was picking up on some kind of energy or something like that? Because there are people that can kind of transfer their energy a lot. Like, there's different psychics and spiritualists that do stuff like that. So maybe it was related to that. But I found the story very interesting. But let me know below what you think about it. So if I was to make a case for real life vampires walking among us, we've got the perfect city that they can walk around in. I mean, they can wear whatever they want or look however they want. They would just fit in New Orleans, no problem. And as for like food, well, nowadays it's a little bit easier, I think, for them to acquire that. And this is what we're going to get into next. Because of the vampire community, essentially people are giving themselves up as juice boxes for vampires in the community. Anne Rice was a big influence on New Orleans and a lot of the vampire interests and lore, but there was another huge influence, and that was Vampyre the Masquerade. And that was a like tabletop roleplay game that eventually turned into like a really big live action roleplay. Like there were vampire clubs and I would go to some of them too. And eventually when the internet came out, it just became their lifestyle. And there's people that just live like this and they live as vampires or they live as juice boxes. Well, let me tell you a little bit more about Vampyre Masquerade. Vampyre Masquerade is a LARPing game that was created in 1991. It started as a tabletop type game which blossomed into LARPing, live action role-playing. And they even also had some video games as well that were pretty popular. The lore of the Masquerade is very intricate. There's different races of vampires. There's like a whole hierarchy structure, caste structure as well. And there's like rules about, I think they introduced like werewolves. There's a bunch of stuff. There's so much detail to this world. It's so fleshed out that it's not surprising that a lot of people have picked this up as their lifestyle. Let's talk a little bit more about that. And this is where we can say, are vampires walking among us? Well, we can definitely say that there's people who are living this vampire lifestyle who are walking among us. They consider themselves vampires. Most of them, we know them as just people who have an interest in living a vampire lifestyle. But what if some of them were actual vampires? Like, what if this is just like a good front for vampires to be able to walk around and get what they want as well? The community that's a part of the vampire lifestyle has been thriving for decades now. In the 90s, vampire clubs were pretty big. I think they were somewhat big in certain areas in the early 2000s, but we're talking like major cities kind of still had some, but there were a lot more actually around in the 90s. Once the internet kind of became like, inside the house all the time, like it was so accessible to everyone, then people started talking to one another through the internet on message boards and websites. And that further expanded the vampire lifestyle and community, but it also made it more accessible, so you didn't have to go to a vampire nightclub just to meet other people in the community. Like I would go to some of the nightclubs too, and I was doing a little bit as well inside the community. It was at the time when the internet was sort of first taking off, but it was like, late 90s still. Late 90s, maybe early 2000s even. Yeah. It was like late 90s or early 2000s, I think, around there. The internet was kind of just becoming into the house more affordable around that time too, so I was sort of on the tail end and the beginning of the other kind of lifestyle. But there's a lot of people in the community, and there's people that, they register themselves as, hey, like I'm a vampire. And then some are like, oh, I want to be a vampire's juice box or pet or whatever you want to call it. And they kind of like live a lifestyle with that, and they find one another and they just live it out. And those are for sure some vampires walking among us. Not classically what we know a vampire as, but people that say they're vampires. I don't want this video to go too long. There's 3 other topics of current vampires walking among us, or vampire stuff in the current modern time, that I think we should talk about honorable mentions on these 3 topics. And if you want to look up some more on them as well, because I could go into a deep dive on some of these, and I don't want this video to go too long. So I'm just going to list them out for you, and I'll put a little bit on the screen for you as well. All right, the first one is Brian Johnson. People call him the real-life vampire because of the way he's going about trying to reverse the aging process. He's even using blood from his son, like he's using it in some serum or something that he's pumping into himself. He's really weird. I don't know. He kind of I find him a little creepy, but if you want to check him out some more, you can take a look at him. Like he looks like even pale and kind of like deathly. He kind of avoids the sun too, but he does this like red thing. It's a very weird story, but I could probably do a whole show on him because he's a very strange one. But check him out if you're curious. You could maybe call him a real life vampire because he's actually using blood to make himself look more youthful. So, which is down the path of Elizabeth Bathory. So it kind of matches that. All right, our second one is psychic vampires. A lot of people talk about these. These are essentially people who can drain the energy of other people. However, with a lot of people talking about mental health more openly nowadays, we do see that there's an overlap here because they have shown that empaths tend to be attracted to certain type of people that drain them, such as narcissists. It happens a lot where even subconsciously narcissists seek out empaths because they want to use them, and empaths end up with narcissists, I think, hoping to help fix them or something. It tends to happen a lot. You'd be surprised how many people end up in these kind of situations and relationships too. So then we have the discussion of, is this psychic vampires or is this just toxic relationships? And you could have a whole big discussion on this. And this comes from personal experience as well that I've been through too. So, it's very interesting. And I do think there's more psychology answer to this versus like actual psychic vampires out there, but you never know. Anyway, if you're curious, do some more research on it as well. Lastly, I'm just going to mention porphyria, and this is a blood-related disease. I don't want to go into too much detail on it because it's kind of like the poor people that end up with this disease, like people like, oh, they're vampires. This is the real life vampire disease. And because it does things like makes you allergic to the sun and you don't have platelets in your blood, or no, you don't have the hemo part of your blood. There's like a bunch of issues that they have to deal with. And, I feel bad for them enough as it is. We don't really have to call them real life vampires, but if you're watching other shows or you're reading other things, this disease might pop up sometimes, and that's all it's coming from. Is this is the only like vampire illness, I guess you could say. Some people say it, but if you want to learn more about it, check it out. I didn't want to focus on it too much in this video. It can be fun to theorize about these things, the things that go bump in the night, and theorize about whether they're real or whether they're really out there. So tell me, do you believe in vampires? Do you think that they're walking among us? What are your thoughts about the influx of stories and vampire things that are showing up on social media? Leave a comment below and let me know. If you're interested in vampires, you may also want to check out my video from last week where I discuss the Goetian demons and also how it relates back to Has-Been Hotel. I will link that video for you right here if you want to go check it out. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and helps me create more content for you guys to check out. Thank you for stopping by, and be careful out there in the shadows.